Okay, welcome to CS-289, Module 3. We're going to go over the installation of IIS and Apache on their various web platforms or OS platforms. Let's talk about IIS first this time. So the whole idea with IIS is that it is actually part of the Windows operating system platform. Whether it is the server platform or the desktop platform, IIS will run on either. The difference is that on the desktop platform, it was never meant for production. That it can run on the desktop platform. We're talking about Windows 10 here at this particular time, but it's really meant for either self-diagnosis or just hosting for yourself to test particular websites just for a particular individual user or small groups of users. Normally, IIS would be deployed as part of the regular Windows server, whether it's 2016 or 2019 as is current nowadays. But this is more of the production environment than Windows Desktop or Windows 10 would be. So in order to install and run IIS, the whole idea is that you're going to install whatever edition of Windows Server you're going to need or want to run first, and then install IIS inside of that particular edition. So you're still going to need the standard or the enterprise or the data center editions of IIS, 32-bit, 64-bit, depending on what your current needs are for deployment. There is the option of deploying IIS inside of Server Core. That's the version of Windows Server without a GUI, but the difficulty is that you're not going to be able to control IIS directly on that particular machine. You can do some remote administration using MMC or Remote PowerShell, but just remember that you're not going to have a direct GUI on that particular operating system. That's perfectly fine. Just keep that in mind that at least for our class, we will probably want a system where we can directly manipulate the operating system as we learn the servers rather than deploying it on core, which you might do in an actual production environment instead. Once Windows Server is installed, IIS platform is not installed by default. You have to actually add it in to the server manager as part of one of the roles for that particular Windows platform. And it is specifically the web server IIS role after installation of a Windows Server. So, install Windows Server, give it its proper names, set up its IP addresses, then go in and configure Windows Server or Web Server as part of the role for its particular set of installation. Ways you typically do that is run through the initial configuration wizard that typically shows up after you've installed Windows Server, or use the Server Manager console that typically pops up and add the particular web server role as part of that particular installation. After you've added the web server role, you can always go back and add and remove additional features, things like ASP.NET support, which we'll do later on in the term, authentication options, content, or filtering, which we will play with again later on in the term. There are other additional options or features that typically only show up afterwards and downloadable from the IIS.NET site later on. We will again practice some of these installation methods when we get through some of the labs this particular term. Important tidbits: the directory c:/inetpub www root is going to be the home directory for the content for the default website that gets deployed when you install IIS web server to begin with. So all of the default content is going to be in this directory. Keep in mind that inetpub, c:/inetpub, is where all of the default content for all of web server material is going to be installed by default, and you probably want to keep most of your content for even additional websites inside of the inetpub folder, mainly to keep track of the correct permissions for this particular server. So keep that directory in mind. A lot of our content on IIS will be hosted in this particular directory on that particular server. One of the configuration options that I mentioned last week and that we will definitely want to keep an eye on is this idea of a default document. And default document is one of the settings in IIS that looks through, it's basically a list of file names that when the server receives a request for a generic URL meaning you've asked for a particular directory or just the root of that particular website, the default document list is what the server will go through and pick out what files it should return to the client by default without the client specifically choosing one particular file. Typical options include your index.htm document, followed by maybe an index.html or an index.php, or any other file that you had put in there. I think iisstart.html might be one of the default documents on the default website installed with IIS server. So we'll look at the default document a lot, especially in lab this week, and manipulating the order of those files to show that whichever file is listed on top, it will just go through the list of files to determine if this file exists before any of the other files below it. That's what's going to get returned to the client when not specifying a particular file in the URL. Main methods of managing IIS, typically the MMC. Most admins like using the Server Manager MMC mainly because it shows a bunch of different tools in one window. I actually don't specifically for using IIS, mainly because it has too many options when you're deliberately trying to manipulate or change options that are specific to IIS. So what I'll typically do is, specifically for IIS, I will open up the administrative tools, Windows, accessories, administrative tools, and look for the IIS Manager MMC. It's more specific just to information that is for IIS, and that way you don't get distracted by things like Device Manager or Disk Utility or things like that there as well. Other methods include the command prompt, the appcommand.exe. Command does a few things that even the GUI IIS Manager does not. We'll look at a few of these settings later on in the chapter. The whole idea there is there are just some features that you don't want to give a GUI to or don't want most people to be able to manipulate easily, and this gives you sort of a administrative or a higher view or higher access to certain commands there as well. Of course, there's PowerShell, which if you've been in any of my Windows classes, I'm trying to add in PowerShell commands where appropriate, and we'll take a look at some of that this particular term as well. But the specific PowerShell commands require the IIS administration or the web administration snap-ins or modules need to be loaded up in PowerShell. So depending on whether or not those get loaded by default on your system, which if you have IIS installed, it should load those modules up by default. But if you're doing PowerShell remotely, then you need to specifically add those modules into the console that you're typing the commands in so that it can send the appropriate commands to the Windows Server operating system that you are manipulating. The IIS Manager will have a page that kind of looks like the diagram here up on the upper right. At each level, there will be certain functions and commands available, settings available for each of the different areas, starting with the server level, which in this case, the Win section, Win64B, blah, 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 so on and so forth, will have settings that you can change. Those settings will be default for anything inside of that particular server level. Inside the server level, we'll have maybe the same options, but also might have slightly different options. The idea being that anything configured at the lower level will override the defaults at the higher level. So you can make, for example, a setting at the file level or the folder level that would override any defaults that were set at the server or the sites level in IIS Manager. These are the specific folders where some configuration files would be stored. It's useful to know in troubleshooting, but is not necessary to keep in mind just for normal administration of the server, just for functional administration of the server. These particular files are typically in XML format, and they follow the XML tag structure, which is similar to HTML tag structure with opening tags and closing tags, slash closing tags, and things like that. The big thing though is you don't really want to mess with these, but you may want to take backups of these particular configuration files just in case something goes wrong at a later date. You have the ability to restore these particular files and get back to operational. Schema files again, yeah, don't mess with these. These define how the settings for your particular server or IIS server are configured. Don't mess with these, but here's where they are and maybe files that you would want to back up. In command line, the app command.exe command is the method that you would use to administrate IIS using the command line, and has access to some additional features that aren't in the GUI. So app command does allow you to add, delete, modify websites and application pools. We'll talk about application pools at a later date. Stop, start websites, etc. One of the biggest things that app command does that typically isn't in the GUI is to be able to back up the settings for IIS right using the command line. Inside of the command path or inside of command prompt, use the app command /? to take a look at what commands or what utilities the app command will allow you to perform. Here's the big things, and one of the things that you'll be doing in lab this week is taking backups. So app command.exe, you can add your backup, give it an optional name. List backup will list any backups that you have saved. And then restore and delete are pretty much your safeguards, so that should something happen to your configuration, you can bring back an original working configuration and get IIS back up and running. So again, as part of lab this week, you will be using this, and I recommend you actually take one of these backups at least once a week, just in case something goes haywire and doesn't render your virtual machine able to be used. In addition, take a look at your VMware snapshots as secondary precautions against what might happen to your particular machines as you're using them from week to week. Here are the PowerShell commands. So app command is one method. Here's the PowerShell commands. And just like in our Windows classes, it's the verb noun mechanism. So here we have backup web configuration, give it a name, and it saves it to this location, system32 inetserv backup. It saves your backup in that particular location. And then the restoring is just the restore web configuration. So when you do these backups, I would recommend in production especially, but when you do these backups, find out where the backup files are stored and copy them off to like a USB drive or to a separate network location. That way, if your system does die and needs to be restored, you can still restore the configuration. Again, these command line backups, as well as your snapshots in VMware, are probably going to be very useful. I recommend taking advantage of those features through the term to make sure that your servers don't just go belly up and have to be restarted from scratch. Each of the week's labs in this particular class do build on each other. So it's not going to be very easy to just skip certain weeks and get back to a working condition, mainly because I draw on labs and websites that we've previously installed and extend them from week to week. All right. Lastly, the idea of remote management. Most of the time, you're not actually running the controls for web server on that particular Windows server itself. Most of the time, you're going to do things remotely. And methods of doing that typically include remote desktop. You're going to do a remote desktop connection into that particular server, or you'll use remote access using IIS Manager, where you run the MMC on a local computer, like your local Windows 10 desktop, but connect the MMC to the actual server itself. So you're seeing the server in the MMC, but you're running the MMC on a remote Windows 10 machine. And of course, it's cut off there at the bottom, the idea of doing remote PowerShell, which in the Windows class, Windows desktop class, we talk a little bit more about remoting from machine to machine and implementing typical PowerShell commands using the PowerShell command line. So that covers the idea of installing IIS on Windows. Next, we'll take a look at installing Apache on the Linux side of things there. So IIS was the web server on Windows. Apache is what we call the web server software on Linux. The literal name is HTTPD. That's the HTTP being the protocol for websites, and the D typically standing for daemon or daemon. So the official name is HTTPD, but the unofficial name we call it Apache. Now, if you do a search for Apache online, you'll see that Apache is more of a project, or has a lot of different projects underneath the Apache name. So this specifically is the HTTPD project that's part of the Apache site, but our shortcut for it is, in this particular class, is just Apache. Oftentimes, when you install a Linux distribution, Apache is often pre-installed. The idea is that when you install a Linux server, it asks you typically, what are the most often used packages installed on this system, and Apache HTTPD is one of the typical ones. When you install your Linux server, please follow the directions that I've laid out for Module 1 and do not install any packages by default. We're not going to use the package version. We're actually going to install from source. So we're going to compile everything and install from source, mainly to show you that the documentation for Apache really follows better with installing from source than from installing from packages. The whole idea is that the Linux distributions that have their own packages typically alter the default location and commands where most HTTP documentation refers to. So if we just install from package, we would have to adapt a lot of the specific documentation settings, and I don't really want to have to do that for every single piece. So in order to use the documentation that Apache provides, we're going to install from their sources rather than installing from Ubuntu's sources directly. So oftentimes, this is kind of another reasons why we want to install Apache. Sometimes the version that's included with your operating system or inside the packages is not the latest version. You want to put it in a different place. So there are other options for installing Apache, either from package or from source. Again, packaging versus source, we are going to install from source. A lot of it is automated, but you do need to follow some specific directions, and I'll hope to verify these before you deploy them in lab. When we install from source, most of the time we're going to download binary files, and we need to, sorry, not binary files, but source files, and we need to verify that the source files that we've downloaded are the official source files and not just something that someone else has uploaded. So oftentimes what we'll need to do is play around with the verification of files after we've downloaded it. So most often we compute a digital signature or do a comparison of the files that we've downloaded with a previously established either key that they typically also have us download with. The idea is we'll download the file and we'll calculate our own signature and compare that signature or compare that certificate with what has been publicly displayed as, hey, this is what you should get when you download our software and run your digital signature. And we'll typically take a look at that. If the signatures match, then you know that what they intended for you to download is what you have actually downloaded. If the signatures do not match, then I would recommend you start over and re-download, because what you've actually downloaded differs from what they intended you to actually download. Two methods are MD5 or SHA1. SHA1 is more secure. So once you've downloaded the files, you run the SHA utility or the MD5 utility, compute the signatures for yourself, and compare it with what should be downloaded from the actual website. Most Linux systems, platforms do install a package manager, and they're oftentimes easier to use than installing from source. Again, we are not going to do it this particular time around. So for us, we're going to need to download the software from the httpd apache.org site. We're going to look for our specific files. The only difference between these two particular files is the extension on the end, GZ versus BZ2. The big difference between them is how they were compressed, either using gzip or bzip. Typically, we're going to look to download the gzip file. We'll need to uncompress and untar, meaning unarchive that particular software, and create a directory where we will have access to the source files in order to compile the code needed for this particular software. If you use the BZ file, the commands are going to be to bunzip and then tar or untar. The -xvf in the tar command there is to extract and to verify, and then which file you're supposed to actually uncompress. These directions will also appear inside of the lab for this week as well. Once we've untarred or uncompressed our code, we'll need to compile our code. The make command, it will actually go through, look at all the source code and compile it, turn it into a binary code for us to run. And the make install command will put the compiled binaries in the correct places for your particular operating system. So once you've done all of these pieces, and again, it will be documented in lab for this week, The pieces for Apache should show up in these particular directories. Slash www bin, conf, htdocs, all those other pieces there as well. Oftentimes you may run into difficulties, which I've hoped to gloss over or at least fix in my lab instructions. Typically, in order to get help with these options or configurations, you'll use the configure -- help command to get more information on how to customize the make or the make install commands specifically to your system. Now for us, again, we're going to install from source code and not from package, mainly because Linux distributions put install elements in different directories than what the Apache documentation states. So in order to make the documentation consistent with our installations, we're going to install from source code instead of from the package information. Once we have that installed, you will need to get into the command prompt in order to start and stop the Apache web server from running. And the big controller program that we're going to be using is called Apache CTL. So Apache control will control the Apache web server from running to not running or starting, restarting, and things like that. So Apache CTL is going to start Apache. While it's running, you can do Apache CTL status in order to see the status of whether Apache is running or not. Or just go onto the local machine and start a web browser and see if you can get to the local website or not. Apache CTL works by sending specific signals to the Apache process. We'll talk more about the process that's running in the background as well. There's no GUI to it. There's no way of accessing the process in the background of the Linux system. So that's what Apache CTL does for you. It sends signals from the foreground, from where you are operating the command line, to the Apache CTL service that's running in the background. So some of these signals typically are going to be a hub or a restart command or a kill all, meaning go ahead and stop that particular process from running. So again, Apache CTL will take care of which specific signal that gets sent for you if you use the proper Apache CTL commands. More examples of specific signals that can be sent. The sig hub signal tells Apache to reconfigure itself, basically to reread the configuration file and reconfigure and use the new settings. So this is useful for when we edit the configuration file for Apache and want Apache to restart with the new settings. Essentially, this is a, hey, go ahead and restart, reuse the new settings, but don't stop the process and start up again. Just keep going, but reconfigure yourself with the new settings that we have installed. The sig term signal tells Apache to shut down, and the sig user 1 signal tells it to gracefully restart, meaning go ahead and end up doing a stop, meaning shut down once all of the processes or all the requests have been processed. Then once you've stopped completely, go ahead and bring yourself back up. If you're following Westworld, this is kind of like the telling the host to pause, shut down, and reconfigure itself and bring itself back up. These are proper commands for the Apache CTL, or the proper options for the Apache CTL command. Start, stop, restart, graceful, status, full status, that requires some configuration, and config test. Config test is going to be super useful because you can test the configuration that you have set up. It will go through and verify that there aren't any glaring errors, but it does not verify whether it's going to do what you actually want. It's just going to test that configuration file to make sure there aren't any syntax errors that it would hang up on, that you could start Apache with that particular configuration. It may not be correct, but at least it would actually start with those settings. With installing Apache from source, the Apache CTL command is buried typically inside of this particular directory. Remember in Linux that if a path appears in your user variable, your user environment variable, then you don't need to type out the full path to the command in order to use the command. So one of the lab instructions will be to set up this particular path so that it does appear in your user environment path, and you can type in Apache CTL without having to type out the full path. OPT, Apache, bin, Apache CTL, each and every single time you want to use it. All right. And the last thing is most times on a Linux system, Apache is automatically started when the user or when the computer starts up, especially if this is a server specifically running the Apache web server that you would want it to start up whenever you restart. Our servers may or may not do this. I think when you install from source, it does not start the web server from scratch. If you wanted to set that up, you would want to change the startup script to specifically bring Apache up every single time that you've restarted. All right, those are my thoughts going through the presentations for this module on installation. The instructions for installing on Windows and Linux should be available online as well. Give those a try. Don't forget that we will, or I will at least, be available on Thursday of this week for questions during the normal lab time. Otherwise, let me know over Teams if you have difficulties or if something is not quite going right during my lab instructions. Let me know if you have any questions, and I will see you in a little bit. Thanks.